Well, we're in part 4 of our series on the Psalms. So if you've got a Bible, do grab it, and we're going to turn up Psalm 4. And a bit like Psalm 3, it's another psalm where David is in trouble. He's in distress. We're not quite sure what the issue is. We're not told exactly, as we were in Psalm 3. But it's not a happy time for David. But even in the midst of his distress, he is able to find hope and joy and peace, and hopefully we will as well. Well, here's Psalm 4. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honour be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts, on your beds, and be silent. Offer right sacrifices, and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Well, in his little book, The Way of the Righteous in the Muck of Life, Dale Davis entitles this an evening prayer. Did you notice in verse 4 it talks about David being on his bed, and in verse 8 it talks about him going lying down to sleep. There's a sense in which this psalm is perhaps one he prays before he goes to sleep. And there's a few things to note here. Ralph Davis divides it into 3 sections. The first one is he looks at verse 1 and calls it urgency and confidence. There's an urgency to David's prayer. Answer me when I call. Be gracious and hear my prayer, he asks. But there's a certain confidence as he approaches God. He knows that God is gracious. When he says, be gracious, there's not a hope, a hopeful expectation. It's a certain expectation. Be gracious to me. He knows that his God is a gracious God. And he knows that God will hear his prayer. Again, he doesn't ask just on the off chance that God might hear, that God might answer. But he knows that God will hear. He knows that God will answer his prayer. So he comes urgently and confidently. The next few verses, verses 2 to 6, he entitles Warning and Counsel. There's various warnings for him to hear here, bits of counsel. Verse 4, for example, says, be angry but do not sin. A great bit of wisdom there. Offer right sacrifices, put your trust in the Lord. There's a sense of David speaking wisdom into his situation. And there's a key word here in verse 3. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. Ralph Davis translates this literally the covenant one. The godly is the covenant one, the one whom is held in God's loving eternal promises. The one who is loved by God's unfailing love. So rather than the emphasis being on the godly as the one who does good, this is the one who is loved by God. In verse 5, we're commanded here, put your trust in the Lord. What a great encouragement from David. Trust in the Lord. And verse 6, in the midst of this distress, in the midst of the night time perhaps when he's praying, he speaks to the Lord and says, lift up the light of your face upon us. He knows that in the midst of distress, in the midst of trial, in the midst of darkness, it is the Lord who can bring his light into the situation. Great counsel and wisdom from David here. And the psalm ends with joy and peace. A beautiful picture of the joy that God gives in verse 7. More joy in my heart than when the grain and wine abound. More joy than the biggest party that they can imagine. We're called to find our joy here in God, not in the things that the harvest provides, not in the things that the world offers, but we find more joy in God. And we're advised here that we can find peace in God. Look at verse 8. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. That was a theme of Psalm 3, wasn't it? That David could go to sleep in confidence, trusting that God was with him. Here too, that thought is repeated. And it's striking that last line, isn't it? For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Right now, I think we're looking at all sorts of answers, all sorts of hopes. What's going to bring safety? Is it isolation? Is it a vaccine? Is it family that surrounds us? What are the things? Perhaps it's financial security. There are certain things at the moment in times of uncertainty that we look to find hope and confidence and certainty. And yet David rightly says, actually, it's only the Lord. It's only God who ultimately allows us to dwell safely and securely. And this is a theme that gets picked up in the New Testament, particularly in Romans chapter 5, where we're told that it is through Jesus, through his love for us, through his death for us, that secures true and lasting peace with God for all eternity. As we face uncertain times, let us turn to the Lord to find our joy and our peace. Amen.